Roosevelt's interest in natural history developed early, and I've lost my.
We can have sound or a slide advancer. Not both.
Yeah.
Okay, I will go to another way. So,
See, lost.
to the coast of Oregon. Here's a quotation from Clay Jenkinson, Rhodes Scholar and faculty member at Lewis and Clark during the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. He said the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Board was in Oregon last weekend for a meeting at Mescalin on the coast. During a break, we walked out onto a small, stormy beach to have a look at the ocean Theodore Roosevelt first saw in 1903. There on the sand was a large seal. We approached it carefully because at first we did not know it was dead. When we finally got close enough to inspect it, we discovered that it had a deep gash on one side near the flipper-like hind legs. The seal was majestic, 8 feet long, with a beautiful pelt and sharp white whiskers. Well, it was an interesting symmetry that when the Roosevelt Library Board was meeting in Oregon, we had that encounter with the natural history specimen that so inspired the future president. Last week, when I was at Harvard, I made this photograph of Roosevelt's boyhood diary, where he was talking about rowing up the river, the Hudson, and visiting the 80-foot waterfall of a neighbor that he put in his boyhood diary. This was a man, a boy, with a lot of intellectual curiosity and tenacity. He was also an 98-pound weakling. He suffered a lot as a child. He had asthma, bad eyesight. He was bullied. He fell, cut himself, broke his bones. He got shot. He was altogether fragile as a young man. So his father said, "You must make your body." He became a boxer, a wrestler. He engaged and delighted in outdoor adventures of riding, hunting, hiking, and camping. He embraced adventure fearlessly all his life. Roosevelt went to Harvard in 1896, and almost at once he associated with those in the natural history arena. Here we see that the Harvard Natural History Society is having an evening event, and Mr. T. Roosevelt is speaking on the gills of crustaceans. And we see one of his bird drawings on the right. He published his first book while he was at Harvard, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks, and notes on some of the birds of Oyster Bay. He was very much intrigued with wildlife. He became a member of the Porcelain Club, founded in 1791. And here we see him seated on a skin rug with the fellow members of this elite social group at Harvard. In 1880, he was writing his senior thesis, and he said in the third line, "In advocating any measure, we must consider not only its justice, but its practicability, viewed purely in the abstract. I think that, to me, the question that women should have equal rights with men, that is, in an ideally perfect state or society, strict justice would at once place both sexes on an equality." 1880. So his thesis was entitled "The Practicality of Equalizing Men and Women Before the Law." It is little wonder that he was a suffrage advocate in 1912. In 1880, at the age of 22, he married a socialite, Alice H. Lee, a member of the extended Saltonstall family of New York. It was love at first and enduring sight. Excepting when they went on their honeymoon, he left Alice at the hotel to climb the Matterhorn. always looking for an adventure. And of course, wearing an outfit and having his photograph taken. The 1880s were a very busy time for Theodore Roosevelt. He enrolled in Columbia University to study law. He was twice elected to the New York State Assembly. He immediately, at age 23, 24, became the head of the Reform Caucus and Speaker of the Republican Party group. And he was also writing a major book, The Naval War of 1812. And he was a young husband. Service in the legislature in Albany was mightily important. He mastered the art of politics. He very astutely said, "The things I wanted to do, I was powerless to accomplish. What did I do? I looked the ground over and made up my mind that there were several other excellent people there with honest opinions of the right, even though they differed from me. I turned in to help them, and they turned to and gave me a hand. And so we were able to get things done. We did not agree in all things, but we did in some. And those we pulled out together. That was my first lesson in real politics." I'd like to share this with the members of the Congress today. The art of politics. On Valentine's Day, 1884, Roosevelt received word that his wife was giving birth to a child in New York. He was in Albany. He jumped on the train and headed to New York City. And when he arrived, he discovered that his mother had died that morning, and that evening his wife died following childbirth. He wrote in his diary a single entry, "The light has gone out of my life." This double tragedy left Roosevelt as a very young widower with an infant daughter, Alice. Here's my friend Theodore Roosevelt on the left, viewing his great-grandfather's diary at the Library of Congress. We had a board meeting in DC, and the occasion was in part to go through the Roosevelt papers in the manuscripts division at the library. So for therapy, Roosevelt, who several times had journeyed west with his older brother Elliot to hunt, such as in the wildlands of Illinois and Indiana, decided to really go west, and he headed all the way out to Medora, North Dakota, in the Badlands of the Little Missouri River, next to the Montana border. And of course, he had to dress for the occasion. He custom ordered a leather buckskin outfit with a dagger made at Tiffany's in New York. He armed himself with guns and pistols, and he also got a cowboy outfit with buffalo leather chaps that he would wear when he was a cattle rancher in North Dakota. He bought land and established the Maltese Cross Ranch. His original ranch house still stands. He was so popular that in 1905, the building was disassembled and brought to Portland, Oregon as an exhibit at the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. And then it was returned to North Dakota, where it stands today in the Badlands and Roosevelt National Park. He purchased another property in the Middle Park unit called the Elkhorn Ranch. And his interest in science and nature led him to purchase a camera, establish a dark room and a dugout under the floor of the house, and develop his own photographs. I believe he was the first president of the United States to take up the art of photography. He also had an opportunity at the Elkhorn Ranch not only to raise cattle, but to hunt for wild critters. And we see all of the antlers on the porch. He later noted it was still the Wild West in those days. It was a land of vast silent spaces, of lonely rivers, and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horsemen. Among Roosevelt's several books was The Winning of the West, where he celebrated the expansion of American population into the Native American lands west of the Mississippi. He met many challenges in North Dakota. He shot a grizzly bear in the Breakhorn Mountains. He barely avoided a duel with Marquis de Moors by proposing rifles at 12 feet. He captured the boat thieves, and marched them to justice during a 24-day adventure. He bested a drunken gunslinger in Montana who fired 2 pistols at Roosevelt. And Roosevelt then described how he hit him with a boxing punch and then again with his right hand. He was involved in robust manly affairs in the far west. Well, the impact of the Badlands on this Harvard-educated, wealthy New Yorker was immense. He later said, "It was here that the romance of my life began. I am myself at heart as much a Westerner as an Easterner. I'm proud indeed to be considered one of yourselves." He was speaking to an audience in Fargo. And he said, "I would have never been president if it had not been for my experiences in North Dakota." Well, he discovered the common American. He discovered conservation. He discovered wild lands. These were transformative. On return trips, he also pursued a former lady friend and married Edith Kermit Carroll in 1886 and had architects design and construction begin on their country home, Sagamore Hill, located in Oyster Bay, New York. It was a farm, home, eventually the summer White House, and the ultimate man cave. Roosevelt's handiwork is in every room but one, and that sprawling mansion. Edith was able to salvage one room with feminine decor, but all the rest of it shows the mark of her husband. The 1880s and early 1890s were a very productive period for Roosevelt as a scholar and writer. With Albert T. Mahan, he wrote, he explored naval power and the importance of having a large military naval fleet as well as commercial fleet. He'd been influenced by Mahan's book on sea power on history. In 1895, he took up a very strange appointment. He was named police commissioner of New York, and he immediately used it to further his reform goals, to clean up corruption in the police department, enforce the laws, modernize the force, keep himself in the headlines, and he allied himself with Jacob Riis, the social reformer photographer who'd written the book, How the Other Half Lives, about the urban poor of New York. And here in this cartoon, we see Roosevelt out on police patrol. He really walked with the policemen on the streets of the city to understand the challenges that they faced. With Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Senator, he co-authored a young people's reader book, Hero Tales from American History. In 1897, Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he loved that job in Washington, D.C. He ordered the U.S. Navy to start building up coal reserves at distant islands and harbors around the world. He advocated modern naval technology, in part the message of Alfred Mahan. He had the fleet practice maneuvers, and he began to take a very assertive stance in foreign affairs. In 1899, he ran and was elected governor of New York, and his reform agenda was immediately apparent. He ended segregation in public schools, improved laws for governing labor conditions. He implemented state conservation and forestry plans, including securing a watershed for the city of New York, and he taxed corporations that operated under government franchises. Then he commissioned another outfit, a military dress, where he headed up a contingent of soldiers to go fight in the Spanish-American War. He recruited 1,000 men and trained them in Texas, as volunteers. 565 of them eventually got to Cuba. And they were a motley lot of cowboys, Indians, football and polo players, tennis champions, and even a master of the hounds. They were in such a hurry to get to Cuba that they left their horses behind, and consequently they were woods weary walkers when they engaged in battles in June and July in Cuba, including the assault on San Juan Hill. Vintage Roosevelt. I've always been unhappy, most unhappy, that I was not severely wounded in Cuba in some striking and disfiguring way. So there was a militarism or bellicosity associated with the character of Roosevelt. The Republican Party was worried about what to do with this fellow, so they parked him in the vice presidency as a candidate with McKinley. Well, McKinley and Roosevelt were elected in November of 1900. They were inaugurated on the 4th of March, 1901. McKinley was shot on the 6th of September and died on the 14th. And suddenly at age 43, Roosevelt became the youngest president of the United States. Mark Hanna, one of the operatives of the Republican Party, said, "Now look, that damned cowboy is president of the United States." They thought they'd put him out of sight and out of mind as vice president, but he acceded to the presidency. And he absolutely loved it. I think this is one of the most popular photos of TR. He's standing there with the world behind him, looking everyone directly in the eye. He really wrested the United States into the 20th century, and he did so during 8 years in the White House. He did not do this alone. He developed a very interesting brain trust of advisors and friends. He drew from the Cosmos Club in DC, where he was a member, and from the towers of the Smithsonian Institution on the Mall. And it was there that he found kindred spirits, such as the geologist, anthropologist, explorer, author John William McGee, who was also president of the National Geographic Society, or John Hay, who began his political career as secretary to Abraham Lincoln, later served as Secretary of State, both for McKinley and Roosevelt. He turned to Gifford Pinchot, of a wealthy Pennsylvania family, who was one of the nation's first European-trained professional foresters, for advice on conservation, and to Liberty Hyde Bailey, an agronomist and botanist who taught at Cornell University. He turned to Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House, a settlement house for the immigrant poor, and to the muckraking author Ida Tarbell, who had written a history of the Standard Oil Corporation and the machinations of John D. Rockefeller Sr. So these were his advisors. He also brought his family to the White House, and that it was a large family. There was his daughter Alice, born to his first wife in 1884, and then Theodore, Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and Clinton. These were the children born to his second wife. Alice proved to be quite popular with the American public. And here we see the Princess Alice cigar box from her early years as a young matron and member of society in Washington, D.C. She lived a very long life and was married to Nicholas Longworth, for whom the Longworth office building on Capitol Hill is named. I think some of us have watched the transformation of the White House over the last year. Well, Trump was not the first to do that. In this Puck cartoon, we see the tedification of the White House with all of those mounted antlers and animal pelts that were put down on the floors in that building. Roosevelt really left his mark on things. He did so in a very interesting way when in 1901, he invited Booker T. Washington to have dinner with him at the White House. This was the first invitation extended to an African-American leader in the nation. It provoked tremendous criticism and was not repeated, but I think was a mirror to Roosevelt's interest in desegregating America. He took on issues, including the unending coal strike of 1902. He forced, as president, the federal government into getting the coal mine owners to arbitrate with the unions. They secured a 9-hour workday and a 10% wage increase. He took on the hydra-headed monster of the coal mining industry. He also challenged the trusts, including Jim Hill, Jay Gould, and J.P. Morgan, who appear in this view of Lower Manhattan. And between 1903 and 1909, using the courts and the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Department of the Treasury, they began regulating monopoly in America. Roosevelt was also aware that the United States was bicoastal, with a great distance between Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And it was his goal to secure the construction of the Panama Canal. The French had spent 20 years and 23,000 lives in a failed effort to build the canal through the Isthmus of Panama. So Roosevelt, articulating the Roosevelt corollary that the United States would ramp up the Monroe Doctrine and insert itself in the Latin American affairs, took on the project of building a canal through the Isthmus. The challenges were many, and one of them was resolved by the upgrading of the public health and marine hospital service, where Dr. Walter Reed and Dr. William Gorgas took on mosquitoes, typhoid fever, and yellow fever. And they helped reduce the number of worker fatalities to about 3,000 deaths during the long years that the United States was involved in building the canal. Roosevelt also was aware that hand-dug canals were not a good idea. And ultimately, he got Congress to fund the purchase of 73 giant Bucyrus steam shovels that were manufactured by the predecessor company that is today Caterpillar. And he was so enamored with these machines that he went to Panama wearing his white outfit and Panama hat to sieve the controls along these giant steam shovels. Roosevelt helped secure the brightest and best engineers and the most sophisticated equipment, as well as health care for the workers in Panama. During his presidency, he was an outspoken foe of anti-Semitism in Europe, sparked by the Dreyfus Affair. And in the cartoon on this slide, we can see that he's standing on a rock, lecturing the crowned heads of Europe on the oppression of the Jews in that part of the world. Roosevelt was aware that Upton Sinclair had written a best-selling book called The Jungle, a muckraking account about the meatpacking industry. Roosevelt went after the problems in meatpacking and in food handling and secured the Pure Food and Drug Act passed by Congress in 1906. It began to clean up food processing as well as use of cocaine and alcohol in medicines. Roosevelt stepped in and helped negotiate a resolution to the Russo-Japanese War. He became the first American president to receive a Nobel Prize for peace in those negotiations, a peace that lasted. One of his greatest legacies, however, was in the arena of conservation. Roosevelt loved to travel the nation. He visited Grand Canyon. He visited Yosemite. And when he was at Yosemite, he went on a 3-day camping trip with John Muir, both in Sequoia and in Yosemite. And in this cartoon, we see that he's declared a truce on shooting animals, instead has invited them to a Thanksgiving dinner where they're going to be offered some protection. Well, the protections were many. Roosevelt said, there can be no greater issue than the conservation of this country. He was a founder of the Boone and Crockett Club, which hunts but also engages in wildlife management. In 1899, he got the Adirondacks set aside as a watershed and forest reserve. Under the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, during his presidency, the United States embarked upon 24 national irrigation projects. These included the Owyhee Project and the Klamath Basin projects in Oregon. In 1903, he began setting aside wildlife refuges, eventually 51 of them during his presidency. He set aside 150 national forests for a total of 150 million acres, and we live with most of those today. He also used the Antiquities Act of 1906 to designate 18 national monuments, including Devil's Tower and Mesa Verde. And during his presidency, there were 5 new national parks, including Crater Lake in Oregon. In 1905, aware that the surviving buffalo were less than 1,000 head, he co-founded with William Hornaday the American Bison Society. And today, there are tens of thousands of buffalo that have descended through the conservation work of the Bison Society, founded in 1905. He was also willing to take on corrupt politicians, including Senator Charles Fulton from Astoria, Oregon, who was closely affiliated with the Oregon land fraud ring, whose misdeeds were chronicled in Stephen Pewter's Looters of the Public Domain, written in 1908 while Pewter was serving time in Oregon prison for defrauding the citizens of the United States of their public lands. Senator Fulton had introduced a bill that would, an amendment on the Agricultural Appropriation Act that would have prohibited Roosevelt from creating any new national forests in 5 Pacific Northwest states. Well, during a 10-day period while that bill was pending, Roosevelt went on a spree, laying out maps from the Geological Survey on the floor of the White House with Gifford Pinchot. And look at all these national forests that he created in Oregon: Klamath, Manaha, Maury Mountain, Blue Mountain, Hepner, Goose Lake, Fremont, Siskiyou, Imnaha, Cascade, Coquille, Tillamook, Umpqua, Crater, and so on. These are called the Midnight Forest Reserves. They were done in that 10-day period before midnight when he lost that authority in the Pacific Northwest. Roosevelt also was president and helped nurture the creation of the United States Forest Service in 1905 to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And Oregon not only has national forests, but national grasslands located near Terrebonne and Prineville in Deschutes County, Oregon. Roosevelt embraced Gifford Pinchot's mantra, the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. In other words, his approach to conservation and his administration was one of wise use. Among the 51 wildlife refuges he set aside was the first west of the Mississippi River, the Three Rocks Refuge at Netark's Bay in Tillamook County, Oregon, visible from the Cape Meares lighthouse in Tillamook County. And of course, there's the imagery of the teddy bear, which is associated with Roosevelt and conservation. Roosevelt also was a patron of the arts, and among the things he accomplished was commissioning Augustus St. Gaudens to design one of the most beautiful coins ever minted by the United States, the $20 gold piece, the Walking Liberty coin. Roosevelt traveled constantly. In 1903, on one train trip, he was gone for 7 weeks. He spoke, He campaigned, he listened, and he tapped the grassroots sentiments of the nation. He was one of the first presidents to really get in deep and close to the American public. And when Congress resisted his leadership, he literally pulled the Republican Party in his direction. He was not averse to bringing political leaders to the White House and talking politics with them. He was soon perceived as holding Congress in his grip, and he was the head of state. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Captain, My Captain, became a theme for Roosevelt's presidency. So popular was Roosevelt, between 1901 and 1909, there were more than 300 publications of sheet music celebrating his various exploits as a president, as a rough rider, as a leader. These are all parts of the collection of the Roosevelt Library. He also had a bit of an ego, and among his costumes, the press suggested that a crown for his imperial adventures in Central America or his building of the Panama Canal might entitle him to wear new fancy hats. Roosevelt left the presidency in 1909 to his friend William Howard Taft, and he quickly discovered that Taft was not his kind of Republican. He greatly regretted that he had not sought another full term for which he was eligible. So in 1912, he bolted from the Republican Party and created the Bull Moose Party, and he really split the presidential vote, and that enabled Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, to get elected. Roosevelt was nearly assassinated when speaking in Milwaukee. He ignored the wounds, the bullet that hit his chest. He spoke for an hour and then was rushed to the hospital. The bullet hit a glass case for his bifocals in his front pocket, went through part of his speech, but it embedded itself in his chest, and he received a bloody undershirt that he was wearing from that attempted assassination. So, what is the measure of this man? He was the author of 37 books. He was elected president of the American Historical Association. He traveled the world. He saw Europe, East Africa, and the Amazon. By revising the NCAA rules, he helped save college football. As president, he advocated a square deal of conservation, consumer protection, and control of corporations. He was devoted to family, and he catapulted the United States to world power. He engaged in effective oratory. Instead of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, President Wilson spoke bombastically and carried a dish rack. Roosevelt could always get a rise out of his audience. He also said, unless a man is master of his soul, all other kinds of mastery amount to little. Or, life is if you were walking or traveling a ridge crest. You have the gulf of inefficiency on one side, the gulf of wickedness on the other, and it helps not to avoid one gulf if you fall into the other. Democracy to be successful must mean self-knowledge and above all, self-mastery. But I think the takeaway of all of them is this long quotation. We here in America hold in our hands the hope of the world, the fate of the coming years, and shame and disgrace will be ours if in our eyes the light of high resolve is dimmed, if we trail in the dust the golden hopes of men. If on this new continent we merely build another country of great but unjustly divided material prosperity, we shall have done nothing. We shall do as little if we merely set the greed of envy against the greed of arrogance, and thereby destroyed the material well-being of all of us. To turn this government either into government by a plutocracy or government by a mob would be to repeat on a larger scale the lamentable failures of the world that is dead. There was a lot of substance in Theodore Roosevelt. He assembled diverse advisors. He pursued a square deal for all Americans. He seized the issues of the time. He shaped opinions by honesty and dialogue. He compromised to reach resolution. He maintained a sense of forward momentum. He traveled the nation, talked and listened to its citizens, and above all, he exemplified ethical values. So, when Roosevelt died in 1919, there were no presidential libraries. The first one was that for President Hoover. And then retrospectively, a library was created for Thomas Jefferson at Monticello and for Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, and of course for succeeding presidents after Hoover. So in 2015, a group of us got together to dream the dream retrospectively of creating a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. And they included in the upper area, Theodore Roosevelt, Serena Roosevelt, and Kermit Roosevelt, three original board members of the foundation. Today, we have a rather robust board. It is a national board. We met last week at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We are distributed from coast to coast. And I guess I'm the survivor. I'm the longest serving board member of this group. And I'm really looking forward to our success. And like Roosevelt, we've squeezed a lot of money out of the nation and philanthropists to achieve our goals. Ed O'Keefe is the executive director. Robbie Lau, for 30-something, is the new director of the library. The library is being built at Roosevelt National Park on the Little Missouri River in the Badlands of North Dakota. And if you haven't been there, let me encourage you to visit. It is an absolutely stunning national park, bisected by an interstate freeway, and it draws over 600,000 visitors each year. This is where Roosevelt operated his 2 cattle ranches in the 1880s. Melanie Walton, another board member, chaired our architectural design committee. And yes, this is the wife of Rob Walton of Walmart. And we invited 15 international architectural firms to respond. They included Daniel Libeskind, Renzo Piano, these were finalists, and Snøhetta, designers of the magnificent Opera House in Oslo and the Alexandria Library in Egypt. Snøhetta gained the nod and was retained to design the new Roosevelt Library. They came up with a very interesting complex of structures on a mesa overlooking the Little Missouri River, with exhibit galleries, library, lobby, research areas, a store, classroom, auditorium, and offices. So this is a design view of the structure. I've actually walked over the roof of this building. You rise 45 feet above the prairies and have a full panorama of the Badlands, the Little Missouri River, and the prairies. And honestly, the horizon is your nearest neighbor when you're at the Roosevelt Library. The ceiling is like that of Portland International Airport. It's a wonderful, magnificent wood ceiling. The interior walls in the main galleries are of rammed earth. And at night, the building will be aglow. There is a mile loop walk along the edge of the cliffs, a boardwalk that takes you to different vistas over the national park. This construction in 2025. Here's construction as of a year ago, May, with the rammed earth walls in the lobby and the really remarkable infrastructure. There are 18 miles of electrical cables in the building. The grand opening will happen on 2, 3, and 4 July 2026. I encourage you to come later in the year or in a future year to visit this magnificent new presidential library. It will have $42 million worth of exhibits that are currently being fabricated by Dimensional Innovations in Kansas City. The library has multiple missions. It is a digital library, and we have 128,000 items currently in digital format. So if you go on the internet and put in Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, these materials are already available for your research. Other programs include scholars, symposia, travel study, internships, special exhibits, online access, and of course the National Park. In fact, in November of this year, we're planning a 3-way travel study program to Panama, sponsored by the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, Lewis and Clark College, Alumni Association, and the University Club of Portland. This has taken a lot of work. To date, we have raised, since 2015, $413 million. We have an endowment now at $57 million, and we just received a few weeks ago an $11 million challenge grant that has to be matched dollar for dollar. Our fundraising efforts will continue through this year and next year. Our ultimate target goal is $550 million. Thank you. In case any of you have some spare time and want to do additional reading, I've put up some of my favorite titles that deal with Roosevelt. He's been the subject of numerous biographies, but these are some that are quite readable, including the one by our executive director, Ed O'Keefe, dealing with the women who so significantly shaped Roosevelt's life and presidency, a book published in 2025. Our board members also include Doris Kearns Goodwin and Professor Brinkley of the University of Texas. It's been a real pleasure to serve on the library board. So some of you may have questions or comments, and I've asked my daughter, Anne-Marie, to assist. One of the unexpected aspects of becoming an emeritus professor is to have impaired hearing. Consequently, Anne-Marie will take your question and then repeat it to me or comment.
Yeah, I can take a mic. They're going to use the microphone, but if you can't hear all.
You'll have to just come up and tell me.
Anyone question?
Professor Beckham, it's a pleasure to sit under your teaching, class of 2000, history major. I was intrigued by DR's apparently early interest in desegregation, and that he invited Booker to Washington to the White House. However, that seems to contradict some of his attitudes towards the Caribbean, some of the language he would often be known to use, referring to the inhabitants of the Caribbean and the imposed segregation in Cuba and other places. I don't know if you could comment on that apparent racial dichotomy in his treatment.
Roosevelt, like most of us, was not perfect. He did not treat Native Americans well in his books. After Booker T. Washington's dinner was so rigorously criticized in the press and by Southern politicians, he backed away from further gestures toward the African American community in the United States. And it is true that his policies in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Panama were not encouraging or uplifting for the people of those nations. However, one of the legacies that is overlooked is that the Roosevelt administration not only built the Panama Canal, but it built hospitals, warehouses, schools, roads, highways, and brought a much more elevated level of healthcare into the colonies that were the prizes of the Spanish-American War. So there is some offsetting for the negatives. And I think in light of his times, Roosevelt's role in desegregating the schools in New York and in reaching out to Booker T. Washington were important steps forward. One other thing, a bit redemptive, was that he introduced the photographer Edward Curtis from Seattle to J.P. Morgan. In fact, he brought Curtis from Seattle to photograph his family at the White House. The introduction to J.P. Morgan led Morgan to fund 30 years of research, and Curtis became the shadow catcher. He made more than 2,000 images of Native Americans and their traditional lifeways and wrote the 20-volume North American Indian. Roosevelt wrote the introduction to volume 1 of that very remarkable set of books. So there's some good and some bad. And in the exhibits, we attempt not to cover up any of the missteps or failures of Roosevelt. We attempt to embrace a full story.
Okay, I have one from the online. I'm going to kind of alternate with some of the folks online. We had 109 people tuning in. We have 97 of them still with us. This is from someone, Posey Scholl, says at one point you mentioned that Roosevelt came from wealth. Can I ask if there's a good way to describe how much wealth he inherited? If possible, it was mentioned before we corrected the sound.
Well, Roosevelt's father died young, and then his mother died. And by the time he was a student at Harvard, he had about $10,000 a year expendable income. And that quickly grew to when he was a young married person, the Roosevelt plate glass factory and company in New York City produced about $20,000 a year of income. Plus, he also had inheritance from his grandparents and his mother's family in Georgia. So he was able to expend perhaps as much as $30,000 to buy ranch land and cattle in North Dakota. So in its day, he was wealthy. I remember in 1923, my grandparents bought a 3-bedroom arts and crafts bungalow for $1,200. And it was a really comfortable home. So the several thousands of dollars of expendable income that Roosevelt had each year put him in a very special class. His 2 wives also had a family income. And consequently, the family had staff, they had a cook, maid, a farm crew that worked at Sagamore. They were well taken care of.
Dr. Beckham, when did you come to Lewis and Clark?
I came in 1977.
Yeah, I missed you by 12 years. Class of 65, and I always knew how much I missed, but now I know even more. Thank you so much.
I started teaching at Winfield.
Yeah, but I wasn't there.
Christians were in Portland, and John Howard and John Brown, orchestrated a very interesting opportunity. In 1975, they sent David Savage out to McMinnville to visit with me, and they said, David said, would you be willing to serve on the tenure and review committee at Lewis and Clark College? I said, oh yes, I'd appreciate that opportunity. Well, it was a chance for me to get to know the faculty and a chance for them to get to know me. And then in 1977, the invitation came to join the faculty here.
Yeah, John Howard, Morgan Odell before him, so much of Lewis and Clark remains from them. My question is, how do you personally deal with all your wealth of knowledge, the breadth of this one president and others? How do you personally handle what's going on now in the Oval Office?
With difficulty. I mean, this is, we're at a really critical moment in our national life. Civic virtue seems to be in very low value. Leadership quality is poor. The understanding of the art of politics is not broadly embraced. We are a divided nation, like we are in Oregon, rich versus poor, urban versus rural, Western Oregon versus Eastern Oregon or Greater Idaho. And somehow we need to find a way to repair the country. And that's why I developed this particular approach to Roosevelt, because his words, his ideas, and his actions really helped weld together a rather remarkable transformation of the United States from an industrialized nation with serious problems about resource use and labor and pollution into the America of the 20th century, where we were born and remember good times. So it is a really challenging to think about how I would teach history today. And I think many of us share those same concerns.
Okay, I saw another question from this side of the room. I was going to try to grab before going on to videos. Just to...
Thank you, Professor Beckham. Class of 1970 here at Lewis and Clark. My wife, class of 76 in Linfield. So we can still get along. Question I have is, Roosevelt was never a member of the regular military, was he?
No, he was not. He was a volunteer.
So he was a volunteer. How did that work out with the U.S. government? He was with an expeditionary force.
It was not easy. He was actually almost in conflict with the military officers in. You want to catch that?
Yeah, I think the question was about how they.
There were tensions with the military elite in Cuba, but Roosevelt, well, in part because Roosevelt got all the press coverage. As one person remarked, when TR went to a funeral, he wanted to be the corpse, and when he went to a wedding, he wanted to be the bride. And that's sort of how he handled the Spanish American War. In fact, Peter Finley Dunn said Roosevelt should write an autobiography about the Spanish American War under the title "Alone in Cuba." So there were tensions. However, he had good relations with some military personnel like Dr. Walter Reed in the research arena. And he was very dependent, of course, upon a robust consular service, customs collectors, and federal bureaucracy. And he really addressed the deferred commitment for infrastructure and administrative services in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Panama, and other colonies that the United States acquired as a result of the Spanish-American War.
So was he a commissioned officer of some sort?
No, I think he's a self-proclaimed officer of his volunteer company, and he trained them himself in Texas.
Okay, we have a few more online questions, and we have some current students with questions. So do we have time for just a few more here? Questions? Okay. So this next question, from Chapin Meyer, I believe, is would love to understand your thoughts on what Roosevelt's square deal principles to regulate, to the billionaire class today. It seems like the state-based approaches only harm the state by pushing away businesses and allow them to move to another state. So I assume a federal solution is required.
Just stand up.
So he's, asking about,
Stand up and tell me. Tell me. Just.
Yeah, you can read the question, yeah. Yeah, it's just here.
No, I know, I remember Chapin. Yeah, I'm Chapin. Well, how would, basically the question is, how would Roosevelt come to terms with the billionaire class today? He took on, in essence, the billionaire class of his time. John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, James Hill, and others. And they did not like his approach. However, they did not desert him either. He somehow had a type of personality and way to work with the wealthy, maybe because he was on the fringes of their wealth and certainly part of their social circle, to make things work. They were not happy when they ended up in court or their trusts were dismantled. However, they did not go backward in terms of wealth. They were already immensely wealthy. So I think what we see today is a president who's also a billionaire, who's part of a fraternity. Roosevelt was not part of the fraternity, and he was able to ameliorate their actions. Hard question, Chapin. All right.
My name is Leo Roth, and I am currently a freshman. So I just want to start off by saying thank you for coming here and sharing this very interesting information about Theodore Roosevelt. It really means a lot, especially through what we're going through in our political climate today. I knew a bit about Theodore Roosevelt before going into this, but I didn't know about his, at the time, very progressive stance on anti-Semitism in Europe. And kind of piggybacking off what some other people have asked, what do you think he would think of what's going on in the world today, of what's going on with anti-Semitism, and how you think he would personally combat that?
The question relates to Roosevelt and anti-Semitism. He was against it, and the Secretary of Treasury Strauss, who I believe was the first Jewish member of the American cabinet, and he was named by Roosevelt. Roosevelt had no patience for anti-Semitism, and particularly the pogroms and persecution in Europe. And he saw the victims of that firsthand when he and Jacob Riis walked into the tenements and explored the immigrant communities in New York City. He really came at it very close up. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant, a journalist, a documentary photographer, and a very close advisor to Roosevelt on issues on immigration and race. So I think Roosevelt would be very unhappy with the anti-Semitism that has surfaced in the U.S. in modern times.
A few online questions about the library. So there's someone just wanting tips on what you need to do to go for your visit. So I think that might be available on the website for the library. But then the other question is, with the opening, can you comment on some of the aspirations it hopes to achieve in preserving Theodore Roosevelt's legacy, and perhaps start to reverse the government by a mob that it has seemingly become?
Well, we hope that the marvelous exhibit galleries will take people through the full life of Roosevelt and the challenges and at times foolhardy things that he did, such as the River of Doubt and his trip to the Amazon, or the dangers he put himself in the Africa safari. The little town of Medora has about 90 residents. Billings County has 800 residents, but Medora has bunking facilities for 2,000 people. Yes, so it has a build out of lodging and restaurants. Or another option is to stay 30 minutes away in Dickinson, North Dakota, or 2 hours and 20 minutes away in Bismarck. And the Roosevelt Library and National Park are right on the interstate freeway that runs across North Dakota and Montana. And one of the wonderful trips that my wife and I took after a board meeting was to head up the Yellowstone River to stop at Pompey's Pillar, where William Clark and the Charbonneau family sojourned, and we headed on west to Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. Or you can do a loop down into the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. So there is a critical nexus of attractions for those of you who want to visit. And as I mentioned, Roosevelt National Park's visitation is around 600,000 people a year. It is a very big draw for those who go to North Dakota. And the library would welcome your visit. Probably not on the opening weekend, but certainly anytime thereafter. The staff will be 53 people. There's be an on-site restaurant featuring a very interesting menu, and of course a bookstore and gift shop.
Do we have time for one last one? One last one.
G. Greenberg, 1979. Also, thank you, Dr. Beckham, for another excellent lecture today. And as you know, I have a great love of geography, so I wanted to ask you about the irrigation projects on the Klamath. And would that relate to the dams that were just recently taken out in the last couple of years?
Can do. In fact, in 2013, I was on the science review panel to Secretary of Interior Salazar, and I read about 3,000 pages of technical reports on the science of removal of the dams, read about siltation, bat habitat, salmon, all sorts of things. And we advised the Secretary that the dams could be removed and the river would recover. The 4 dams were built by COPCO, California Oregon Power Company, and then were bought by Pacificor, a Berkshire Hathaway company in more recent times. They are unrelated to the Klamath Reclamation Project. However, Keno Dam, which was not part of the electrical system at Keno, still blocks the river, but it is integral to the stabilization of water in the Klamath Basin, both the remnant of Lower Klamath Lake and Upper Klamath Lake. So there's still a bit more balancing of water in that area. The unfortunate thing about the Klamath Reclamation Project is that it was probably too ambitious when it started in 1903. It brought far more land under irrigated farming than the watershed could sustain adequately. And consequently today, there's the prospect that there will be perhaps a buyout of some of those reclaimed farms, arid lands, so that there would be less draw on the water that is available for irrigation. Thanks, Jake. You're such a good friend. Jake has joined us on some of the Zodiac travel study programs, and even attended the lecture I did at the Lake Theater in Lake Oswego. To all of you, thank you for joining us both in person and virtually via Wi-Fi. It's a delight to be back in the classroom at Lewis and Clark College. We have upcoming 3 more lectures, one in March, April, and May, and I'm hoping that this might become a template where some of my other retired colleagues will come and share a bit of their teaching with their alums.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.